The year was 1874, and the town of Dry Willow lay burning under a noon so white it stripped the color from everything it touched. The air clung heavy with iron and horse sweat, the kind that tasted of rust when you breathed too deep. Somewhere a shutter slammed, then stilled, and the silence afterward felt like the desert holding its breath. Isaiah Cole walked slow through it, hat brim low, boots raising small ghosts of dust behind him. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, but the sound of his own footsteps was enough to remind him he was still here, barely. The stable yard was crowded, though no one worked. Men in rolled sleeves stood with thumbs in their belts, faces shining with heat. Women clutched children close against their skirts, whispering without lowering their eyes. A rope hung from a hitch post, its fibers dark with sweat and dust. Beside it stood a girl. No, a woman, barefoot, wrists tied. Her dress was torn at one shoulder, and her skin, tanned and streaked with dirt, shivered against the sun. Sheriff Macklin leaned against the post, flask dangling from his hand. $5, he said, voice raw from drink. She's yours, if you want the trouble. The crowd gave a dry laugh, one that died too fast. Isaiah stopped at the edge of the heat, hat shadow cutting his eyes in half. He smelled kerosene from the trading post, heard the low hum of flies gathering where sweat pooled. Lila Harrow didn't move. Her eyes were open, but distant, dark as cooled tar, staring somewhere no one else could see. Her lips parted slightly. No sound came. Isaiah knew that silence. He'd lived inside it. The war had left a ringing that never faded, and years alone on Black Sage Ranch had turned that ringing into habit. Watching her, he felt that old ache shift, the one he thought had hardened into stone. He meant to keep walking. He always meant to. But something in the way her chin stayed lifted stopped him. Time 800 massons. Not pride. Defiance, maybe. Or the last ember of a person the world had decided was done. He remembered another face. His wife. Coughing in the winter cold. The sound thinning until it broke into nothing. The same quiet on her lips when she ran out of air to beg with. That memory struck him like a hand. He walked forward. The crowd parted, murmuring his name with the kind of curiosity that carried judgment. Isaiah pulled the strap of his satchel over one shoulder, opened the worn leather pouch, and set $5 silver into the sheriff's palm. The metal clicked against the skin, sharp in the heavy heat. Macklin blinked, then laughed. Your problem now, Cole. Isaiah didn't answer. He stepped to the post, pulled his knife from the belt sheath, and cut the rope clean. The woman flinched, but didn't look at him. Her arms fell weak at her sides, wrists raw where the hemp had bitten through. He caught her gently by the elbow, but she swayed, nearly went down. For a second, her hand brushed his sleeve, just a flicker of skin against fabric, hot as a coal. He steadied her, wordless. He lifted her into his wagon, the boards creaking under the shift of weight. She didn't resist, only folded in on herself, breath shallow. Isaiah covered her with his coat, heavy with the smell of leather and dust. The murmurs followed as he climbed onto the seat and took the reins. He didn't look back when the wheels started turning, but he felt the eyes on him all the same. The road out of dry willow stretched empty ahead, rippling in the heat. A wind picked up, faint but cutting, lifting the edge of her coat. He saw the outline of her shoulder, thin but unbroken. He wondered if she even knew she was free. She didn't turn her head, didn't seem to hear the wagon wheels, the mule's snorts, or his quiet breath. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she just didn't want to anymore. By the time the town was a smudge behind them. The sun had lowered enough to cast long shadows across the plain. The smell of iron gave way to sage and dry clay. Isaiah glanced once at her, asleep or pretending, her face half hidden in the crook of her arm. He looked away, jaw tight. Whatever this was, it wasn't mercy. He told himself that. But even as he did, he knew he was lying. The horizon ahead shimmered, a blur, as if the land itself was waiting. Somewhere in that heat, something shifted inside him. A soundless chord he hadn't felt in years. He flicked the reins once. The mules obeyed. The wagon rolled toward the edge of the world. Behind them, a laugh cut through the air. Faint, but sharp. Ewing Tate stood at the far end of town, watching them go, hat tilted, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The sun had begun to tilt west, bleeding its light into a pale, washed sky. The road out of dry willow was a thin, crooked scar through open land, where wind scraped over stone and grass that hadn't been green in years. The wagon wheels groaned with each rut, the sound a dull rhythm against the empty fields. Isaiah sat upright on the driver's plank, reins loose in one hand, hat pulled low. His coat was gone, spread over the figure lying motionless in the back. The mule snorted, shaking its head, as if it too wanted to forget the town behind them. Isaiah didn't look back. The smell of rust and sweat still clung to his throat, the echo of laughter following him farther than it should. He had seen cruelty before, in camps, in fields of smoke and red dust, but something about that crowd's ease unsettled him. They hadn't looked away. None of them had. He glanced over his shoulder once. The woman hadn't moved. Her dark hair stuck in damp strands to her cheek. The coat half slipped down to her elbows. Her lips were cracked. The skin along her neck sunburned raw. He reached for the water canteen, hesitated, then climbed down and walked to the back. The boards creaked under his boots. "Here," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure she could hear. He lifted her head, poured a little water into his palm, and pressed it to her mouth. Her lips parted, instinctive. She drank, slow and careful, as if every swallow cost her something. When she was done, he capped the canteen and set it beside her hand. Her fingers brushed it once, tentative, then fell still. Isaiah caught himself studying her face longer than he meant to. It wasn't beauty that held him, but the strange calm of it, like someone who had already decided the world owed her nothing more. He recognized that look. He'd worn it once himself. The mule stamped, impatient. Isaiah stepped back, climbed to his seat, and flicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward. The road ahead shimmered under the horizon, fading light. The air rippling in waves that made the horizon waver like a mirage. He breathed in the scent of sage and dust, sharp and grounding, a reminder that the world still moved. For miles they didn't speak, not that he expected to. When the first shadows stretched long across the ground, he turned off the main trail, following a narrow cut through scrubland toward a low ridge. The land there was lean, but quiet, the kind that made silence feel earned. He felt her stir then, a small sound, not a word, more like breath catching on a dream. Isaiah slowed the wagon, glancing back. Her eyes were open now, unfocused, catching what was left of the light. She pushed herself up on one elbow, weak but deliberate. "You're safe," he said, slower this time, forming the words clear. He didn't know if she read lips. She blinked once, then turned her gaze to the horizon. The sun slipped lower, burning the edges of the hills in gold. She reached toward the rim of the wagon, fingertips tracing the wood, like she was listening to its grain. Her hand stopped at a scar along the board, the mark of an old split, mended with iron nails. Isaiah watched, then took a piece of charcoal from his vest pocket. On the inside panel of the wagon, he wrote in block letters, "Safe here." He tapped it once with his finger, to be sure she saw. Her eyes followed the motion. She nodded faintly, the corner of her mouth twitching. Not quite a smile. Not yet. He sat back again, hands resting on his knees. The land ahead was flattening out now, opening to a basin of tall, dry grass. A wind ran through it, setting the stalks to sway like a tide. It was the same path he'd taken 100 times before, though tonight it felt different, like he was carrying more than a wagon load home. Dusk came fast. The sky turned the color of cold ash, and the first coyote called from somewhere past the ridge. Lila, he didn't yet know her name, curled beneath his coat, knees drawn close, the canteen held against her chest. Isaiah listened to the small creak of the wheels, the mule's uneven breath, the beat of his own heart trying to find a rhythm that fit this strange quiet. He thought of the war again, nights when he'd marched through fields with no sound but wind, and memory. Back then, silence was a wound. Now, it felt like a truce. When the first stars rose, faint and scattered, he reached into the wagon and adjusted the coat around her shoulders. She didn't wake, but her hand twitched, lightly brushing his wrist before falling still. That single touch lingered long after he drew back. The ridge ahead caught the last of the light, a low line of rock and scrub that marked the edge of his land. Beyond it, the cabin waited, dark, cold, and alone, same as always. Isaiah tightened his grip on the reins. Behind him, the wind shifted. Somewhere, faint but distinct, came a sound that didn't belong to the desert. The echo of a laugh, carried far on the dry air. He turned, scanning the horizon, but the road behind was empty. Only dust and the trail they'd made. Still, the sound stayed with him. He didn't look back again. The wagon rolled on into the dark, toward the waiting hills, where the scent of smoke and pine would soon take the place of rust. Night had already laid its heavy hands across the valley when Isaiah reached the ridge. The wagon creaked up the final slope, hooves thudding against hard soil, until the land opened to a wide basin brushed by moonlight. Black Sage Ranch sat alone at its center. One cabin, one fence line, and a scatter of dry grass that whispered under the wind. Smoke stains marked the chimney like old scars. Isaiah drew the reins and let the mules stop. The air smelled of pine sap and cold ashes. His back ached from the ride, but the ache was familiar, almost welcome. He climbed down, boots sinking into the soft dirt, then walked to the rear of the wagon. Lila was still curled beneath his coat, breath shallow but steady. Her hand rested on the canteen, fingers twitching once as he approached, though her eyes stayed closed. "Home," he said quietly, though it wasn't really one. Not anymore. He hesitated before lifting her again, careful not to wake her. Her weight surprised him. Lighter than he expected, yet solid. A reminder she was alive. The warmth of her skin bled faintly through the cloth as he carried her up the short path. Each step echoed in the hush, the boards of the porch moaning as if they hadn't borne company in years. Inside, the air was cool and dry, thick with the scent of old timber and dust. A single lantern hung by the door, the glass clouded but intact. Isaiah struck a match. The flame flared, small and stubborn, then caught. Light spilled across the room, touching the edges of things that had gone unseen too long. A table, a chair, a rifle on the wall, a bed half made with rough wool blankets. He lowered her near the hearth, arranging the furs into a kind of nest. The fire had long died, so he gathered kindling, broke it over his knee, and built a new one. Sparks leapt, then settled into a soft orange hum. The warmth spread slow, curling into corners. Lila shifted, murmuring something too soft to catch. A fragment of thought. Without sound, Isaiah poured water into a pot, set it above the flame, and sat back on his heels. The rhythm of work steadied him. Fire, water, breath. Outside, the wind brushed the shutters like fingertips. He could hear the lowing of his mule, the squeak of the harness still hanging loose on the wagon beam. The sounds folded into each other until they felt like the shape of solitude itself. After a while, he took a blanket from the chest, shook the dust from it, and laid it gently over her. The motion stirred her awake. Her eyes opened, dark, unfocused, and found the light. She looked around, wary but calm, her gaze landing on him for the first time. Isaiah froze, unsure whether to speak. He lifted a hand slowly and pointed to the water boiling near the fire. She followed the motion, then nodded once. He poured a tin cup, waited for it to cool, and offered it to her. She sat up halfway, took it with both hands, and drank. The sound of her swallowing was the only thing in the room. When she finished, she placed the cup on the floor, fingers tracing the rim as though memorizing it. Then she looked at him again. He tried a word, slow and clear. Safe. He mouthed it more than he spoke it, exaggerating the shape so she could read it, if she could. Her brow tightened, then smoothed. She raised one hand, touched her chest lightly, and drew a small line in the air, something like acknowledgement. Isaiah nodded. He didn't press. Instead, he turned back to the stove, poured himself a cup, and sat down near the fire. The warmth soaked into his palms. The crackle of the burning pine was sharp, rhythmic, almost musical. He tapped his thumb against his knee without thinking. 3 slow beats, a habit that had once guided his choir singing. Years ago. The sound filled the silence gently, like testing if it still belonged to him. Lila's head turned slightly. Her eyes caught the zaton movement of his hand. She tilted her head, then reached out, pressing her fingertips to the floorboard near the fire. When Isaiah tapped again, her fingers trembled as she felt the vibration. Something flickered across her face. Not surprise exactly, but awareness. He stopped. She lifted her hand, and for a second, it seemed she might tap back. But she didn't. Her hand fell to the blanket instead. Her gaze drifted to the flicker of the fire, to the curl of smoke rising from the pot. Her lashes trembled, then stilled. Sleep came over her again, heavy and deserved. Isaiah watched the flames climb and fall. The firelight threw shifting shapes along the walls, shadows that almost looked like figures moving, living. He could almost believe the house was fuller than it was. The ache in his back deepened, but beneath it was something quieter, almost human. Outside, a coyote howled once, the sound sharp and brief, before the wind swallowed it. The mules shifted restlessly in the dark. Isaiah leaned forward, fed another piece of pine to the flames, and listened as the cabin settled into its old rhythm: wood, wind, and breathing. The fire dimmed a little, its glow gathering around the woman sleeping by the hearth. Her profile was soft in the light. Her lips parted slightly as she dreamed. Isaiah's hand moved without thought, setting his old hat on the peg by the door. The gesture felt final, like he had crossed into a place he hadn't meant to return. He looked once more at her, then at the small lantern trembling on the table, its glass fogging with heat. The wind outside shifted direction, brushing against the cabin walls with a slow, hollow sigh. Isaiah listened. In that long exhale of the night, he could almost hear something else beneath it. Something faint, a sound that might have been the whisper of footsteps, too far away to see. Morning crept slow across black sage, sliding through the gaps in the shutters like thin gold threads. The smell of wet ash and pine lingered from the night before. Isaiah woke before the light reached the floor, as he always did, his body trained by years of work and quiet discipline. He sat on the edge of the cot, pulling on his boots, listening to the cabin breathe, the faint crackle of cooling embers, the whisper of wind through the boards, the steady rhythm of another person sleeping nearby. He wasn't used to that sound. It filled the air differently, softer, alive. Lila stirred under the blanket by the hearth. Her hair had loosened in the night, spilling across her cheek. When she blinked awake, the room reflected in her dark eyes, small and still, like she was measuring the distance between this morning and every morning that had come before. Isaiah poured water into the pot, dropped in a handful of beans and dried meat. The steam rose, carrying the sharp scent of salt. He glanced at her, then tapped the edge of the table twice with the side of his hand. A small signal he didn't think through, just the way one might call attention without noise. She looked up, caught the movement, and waited. He tapped once more, then pointed to the pot. Breakfast. She hesitated, then pressed her palm to the floorboard near her. When he tapped again, she felt the vibration and moved. The corners of his mouth lifted, barely. She understood. When the beans were ready, he set a tin bowl on the floor, close but not too close, and stepped back. Lila sat cross-legged, lifting the spoon slow, cautious. The taste must have been harsh, salt and smoke, but she ate without complaint. When she finished, she placed the bowl carefully beside her and glanced toward him. Isaiah nodded once. She gave a single nod back, something faint but deliberate, like the beginning of language. The day unfolded in silence. He mended the fence, brought in the water barrel, and split a few logs for the evening fire. Lila stayed near the cabin, washing the tin bowls, sweeping dust out the door with a bundle of pine twigs. Each time he passed, she straightened slightly, but didn't step away. The rhythm between them grew, him moving in the open, her listening with her hands, the two of them finding a way to occupy the same quiet without breaking it. By late afternoon, clouds gathered low over the ridge. The air grew heavy, metallic. Isaiah stacked the last of the wood and felt the shift in pressure, the way the wind turned colder before rain. Inside, the light dimmed to amber. Lila sat by the table, tracing small marks in the dust, lines and dots like a code. He watched, curious. When she saw him looking, she brushed the marks away, embarrassed. He shook his head gently, then tapped the table once, twice, thrice. She looked at him, brow furrowed. He did it again. 3 beats, even and soft. Then he pointed to the door, then to himself. Going out. She nodded, repeating the rhythm on the table with her fingertips. He froze, surprised at the sound, the faint drumming of her nails, matching his own. When she realized she'd done it right, her lips curved into something like a smile. Not wide, not bright, just real. It became their way after that. 3 taps meant come, 2 meant wait, 1 meant done. A small vocabulary built on patience and quiet trust. As evening pressed in, the sky darkened to a deep blue-gray. Rain hung in the air, unfallen, but near. Isaiah pulled the shutters half closed and lit the lantern. Lila sat near the fire again, her knees drawn close beneath the blanket. Her fingers traced the wooden floor, feeling for the same rhythm he'd used earlier. He found himself watching her hands, the way they moved like she was learning to hear through them. "You can rest," he said quietly, not expecting her to understand. But she lifted her head, eyes steady, as if she did. He sat at the table, the lantern between them, its flame trembling in the draft. The wind outside rose, whistling through the seams of the cabin, like breath caught in the throat of the earth. Lila turned toward the sound, her face calm, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the flame. A low rumble rolled from the east, slow and distant. Thunder. Isaiah stood, checked the door latch, the windows, the fence line through the small glass pane. The storm was still far, but coming fast. When he turned back, Lila was still at the table. She lifted her hand and tapped 3 times against the wood. He stopped. She nodded toward the fire, then toward the shutters. Her way of saying, "Close them." He smiled, despite himself, and did as she asked. The first drops hit the roof. Light at first, then harder. The smell of rain pushed through the cracks, mingling with smoke. Isaiah sat again. Between them, the lantern flared, shadows breathing along the walls. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The storm would speak for them soon enough. Outside, thunder rolled closer, the air thick with its pulse. The mule brayed once from the shed, restless. Isaiah stood to move, but Lila raised a hand, just a small motion, and shook her head. Her expression was calm, almost certain. He hesitated. Then the wind howled, sudden and low, rattling the shutters. The first hard crack of lightning lit the room white. In that burst of light, she looked at him, not with fear, but understanding. Time 900, a soundless exchange, an unfinished sentence, waiting for its answer. The sky broke open. Rain slammed against the roof, filling every corner with its roar. The storm didn't fall all at once. It gathered, thick and waiting, like a hand about to close. By dusk, the air had turned to lead. Every sound in the valley sounded sharper. The click of the latch, the creak of rope, the dull shuffle of hooves inside the shed. Isaiah moved through it with quiet precision, sleeves rolled, the smell of rain already climbing through the wind. He checked the window planks, pushed barrels against the door. His palms were slick with sweat and dust. Lila followed, her bare feet silent on the floor, helping him brace the shutters. They moved together without words, a rhythm built on watching and knowing. When she needed him to hold a board steady, she simply met his eyes. He understood. Lightning flared once beyond the ridge, quick and white. Isaiah counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. Before thunder struck, low and heavy. The storm was close. When everything that could be secured was secured, he set the hammer down and wiped his hands. Lila stood near the table, strands of hair clinging to her cheek, skin glistening with sweat. The lantern threw a warm pulse across her face, and he realized he'd been staring too long. He looked away, poured 2 cups of water, and pushed one across the table toward her. She didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she drew her finger through a patch of dust on the wood, writing in slow, deliberate strokes. Why pay? The letters were rough, but clear. Isaiah stared at them, unsure whether to answer. Rain began to tap at the roof, soft and scattered. He took the stub of charcoal from the shelf and wrote beneath her question. No one else did. She watched the words form, eyes following each line until he stopped. Then, after a moment, she added her own. Why, me? Isaiah exhaled, the air thick in his chest. He thought of that moment in Dry Willow, the rope, the laughter, the sun burning down on her skin. He remembered the way she hadn't bowed her head, even when they mocked her. He remembered how that quiet, defiant stillness had felt familiar, like something he'd once carried and lost. He wrote slowly. You stood. Her eyes lifted from the table to his face. The silence stretched between them. But it wasn't empty. It was charged, like the air before thunder. She reached for the charcoal, her fingers brushing his knuckles. The contact sent a sharp warmth through him. She wrote one more word. People. Then she looked at him, waiting. He frowned, not understanding. She touched her own chest, then drew a small circle in the air. Her way of saying, the others. He hesitated, then nodded. They didn't see, he said quietly, knowing she might only catch the shape of the words. They never do. Lightning cracked again, closer this time. The flash filled the cabin with white, and for an instant her face looked carved from firelight and shadow. Strong, unbroken. She lifted the charcoal one last time and wrote in large, uneven strokes, I am. Then she underlined it, twice. Isaiah read it, throat tight. Yes, he murmured. You are. The rain began in earnest, pelting the roof in fierce rhythm. Water seeped through a crack near the sill, streaking down the wall. Isaiah moved to patch it with a rag, but Lila caught his sleeve. Her fingers held firm, urging him to stop. She pointed to the window, the lightning outside painting the sky violent silver, and then back to the table. She wanted to keep talking. He stood still, watching her. Then he took the charcoal and wrote again, smaller this time. You safe here. She stared at the words for a long moment, as though weighing them. Then she picked up the cup he'd given her, drank, and set it down without a sound. The rain softened for a breath, a thin calm in the middle of the storm. Lila leaned forward, her hand brushing across the letters until only smudges remained. Then she wrote a single word where the old ones had been alive. Isaiah nodded. The word hung between them, fragile and certain. Thunder rolled again, deeper, longer. The walls shook slightly. He walked to the hearth, adding wood to the fire. The flames leapt up, throwing waves of orange across the ceiling. Lila stood near the wall, her palm pressed to the timber, feeling the vibration of each sound, the wind, the thunder, the hum of the house itself holding against the storm. Isaiah turned to her. "You should rest," he said. She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the window. The rain had turned wild now, streaking sideways in gusts. She seemed to be listening to it through her bones. The lantern flickered, the glass rattling. Isaiah reached for it, steadying the base. The smell of smoke, wood, and rain filled the air until it became hard to separate one from the other. He looked back at her. She stood in the middle of the room, motionless, her face half lit by firelight. Her hair whipped against her jaw as the wind pressed through the cracks. Her mouth opened slightly, like she might speak, but no sound came. Then, as if deciding something deep inside herself, she nodded once and mouthed a word he couldn't hear. The next flash of lightning swallowed her face in white, and the door shuddered violently on its hinges. The storm broke open before midnight. Wind clawed through the valley like something alive, shaking the trees until their roots moaned. Rain came sideways, hammering the roof, hissing down the chimney. Inside the cabin, the fire bent low, its flames thin and strained against the wet draft. The air smelled of wet wood and cold iron. Isaiah braced the door with his shoulder, pressing it closed against the wind. The sound outside roared so loud it felt alive in his bones. When he turned, Lila was standing near the table, her eyes fixed on the window. The lantern swung on its hook, throwing restless shadows across the walls. He gestured for her to move back from the glass, but she didn't. Instead, she lifted her hand and pressed it flat to the wood, feeling the storm's pulse through her palm. Her hair whipped loose around her shoulders, and for a moment Isaiah saw something fierce in her stillness, like she belonged to the wild noise, not apart from it. He crossed to her and set his hand over hers. The boards vibrated between them, carrying the thunder. Lila looked up at him, her face lit by the flicker of the lantern, and he realized she was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer force of sound she couldn't hear. She was feeling it, letting it move through her the only way she could. Isaiah stepped back, found the old guitar hanging near the window. The strings were rusted, the wood dull, all he had left from a time before the silence. He hadn't touched it in years. When he plucked one string, it hummed faintly, swallowed by the storm. He tried again, firmer this time, and the low note drifted out like a voice half remembered. Lila turned, startled, She couldn't hear the tone, but she watched his fingers and saw the rhythm in his shoulders. He played 3 notes, slow, steady, then tapped the body of the guitar in a pattern she recognized. 3 even beats. She pressed her palm to the table, feeling for the pulse. Time 900. Then she moved closer, resting her hand along the wood where his rhythm echoed. He played again, this time matching the thunder's low roll outside. She felt it, eyes half closed, her breathing falling into sync. When he stopped, she took the guitar by the neck and tapped the surface herself. 3 beats, then another 3, off tempo, but alive. He smiled, a small, cracked thing, and joined her. Between the two of them, a strange music filled the room. Not melody, not harmony, just rhythm. The rain outside became their percussion, the thunder their bass. Each strike of her hand, each pluck of his string, folded into the storm until the cabin felt less like shelter and more like a heart beating through wood and wind. Isaiah began to hum. Not words, not tune, just a sound pulled from deep in his chest. He hadn't made a sound like that in years. Lila's eyes widened slightly. She couldn't hear it, but she saw his throat move, saw the vibration in the air, and her fingers followed his tempo. Lightning flared, and she stepped closer, almost touching his arm, tapping once more against his sleeve to keep the beat. He stilled, looking down at her. She looked back up, breath rising fast, cheeks damp, not from rain, but from tears she didn't seem to notice. They stayed like that. 2 people in a small house shaking under the weight of a storm, their silence carried by sound they couldn't share, but still understood. The fire hissed as a drop of rain slipped down the chimney, spitting sparks. Isaiah set the guitar aside and leaned forward, palms open toward the flame. Lila knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his, her skin catching the light. Then she touched the space between them with her fingertips, a small, grounding gesture, as if to say, "I hear this too." He met her gaze. There was no need for words. Hours passed. The thunder rolled farther east, softening to a dull growl. Rain eased into a whisper. The wind lost its teeth. The storm had spent itself, leaving only the quiet aftermath. The drip of water from the roof, the sigh of wood returning to stillness. Isaiah leaned back against the wall, exhausted. His hair was damp, his shirt clinging to his shoulders. Across the room, Lila sat by the window, legs drawn up, watching the fading flashes of lightning over the hills. She seemed calm now, her face lit by the last glow of the coals. He found a scrap of paper near the lamp and wrote a single line, "Storm done." She took the paper, turned it over, and wrote beneath it, "I stay." He froze, staring at the words. She set the note on the table and met his eyes. No hesitation, no plea, just truth. Isaiah felt the ache in his chest shift again, something breaking open and quiet inside him. He nodded once. "All right," he said softly. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, no longer angry, just tired. He stood and walked to the door, opening it an inch. The smell of wet sage drifted in, clean and sharp. The first faint stars were peeking through the clouds. Behind him, Lila moved closer to the fire, wrapping his old coat around her shoulders. The sound of her breathing filled the cabin. Steady, alive. Isaiah closed the door gently and turned back, the rhythm of the storm still echoing faintly in his bones. By dawn, the storm was nothing but a shiver on the horizon, a pale bruise of cloud retreating toward the east. The air smelled of ash and wet earth, heavy and clean. Water dripped from the eaves in a slow rhythm that matched Isaiah's breath as he stepped outside, boots sinking into mud. His land stretched before him, slick and shining, the fence line bowed but standing. He drew a long breath, ran a hand over the mule's flank, and whispered a soft word of thanks. The animal blinked, unbothered. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Lila stepped out, wrapped in his coat, her hair dark with moisture. She moved barefoot, the hem of her dress already soaked, but she didn't seem to mind. Her eyes followed the line of the hills where the last of the thunder rolled away. Isaiah handed her a tin cup of water. She took it without looking at him, drank, then handed it back. He pointed toward the ridge. "Creek's swollen," he said. "Stay close." She didn't nod, but began to walk beside him. Her steps light and sure despite the uneven ground. They worked in silence, gathering fallen branches, checking the fence posts for damage. Each time he moved ahead, she followed, keeping just within reach but never in his shadow. When a loose board snapped under her hand, he caught it before it could splinter. Their fingers brushed, a small, quick contact that neither mentioned. By noon, the air thickened again, the light turning the color of pewter. A lone rider appeared on the far trail, a dark speck moving through the haze. Isaiah's shoulders tightened. He knew that gait, the slouch of the hat, the glint of a silver spur that didn't match its pair. Ewing Tate. He came slow, his horse limping slightly, mud caked up its legs. Isaiah wiped his hands on his trousers and waited by the fence. Lila stood still behind him, coat gathered at her throat, her eyes narrowing. She couldn't hear, but she could feel the shift in the air, the way the ground seemed to hold its breath. Ewing stopped 10 paces from the gate, the reins loose in one hand. "Morning, Cole," he said, voice rough from drink and dust. "Heard tell you picked up something that don't belong to you." Isaiah didn't answer. He kept his stance steady, hands relaxed, but near his belt. The wind tugged at the tail of his coat, scattering drops of rain off the brim of his hat. Ewing's grin was thin. "Government still keeps track of folks like her. You know that, right? Tribal property. Papers say she's to be returned." Lila's eyes flicked from Ewing's mouth to Isaiah's. She read the tension there even if she couldn't hear the words. Her hand found the nearest post, palm flat, feeling the vibration of the man's voice through the wood. Isaiah's tone stayed even. "She's not property." Ewing laughed, low and mean. You can dress it up however you like, preacher man. But paper's paper. I'm just here to collect. Isaiah shifted his stance, enough to make his shadow fall long across the mud. You ride off now, he said, or you won't ride at all. Ewing's hand drifted toward his coat pocket, where metal glinted. Isaiah's moved slower, deliberate, until his fingers rested on the butt of his revolver. The distance between them was short enough that the next breath might break it. Then, Lila moved. She stepped from behind the fence, into the open. Her coat slipped from her shoulders, rain-dark fabric clinging to her dress. She stood tall, back straight, face unreadable. She didn't look at Isaiah, didn't look at the gun. Her gaze locked on Ewing's, steady as stone. For a long moment, none of them moved. Only the sound of rain dripping through leaves, the groan of saddle leather. Ewing's smirk faltered first. He looked from her to Isaiah, then spat into the mud. Suit yourself, he muttered. Don't say I didn't warn you. He tugged the reins, turned the horse, and rode off slow the way he'd come. The sound of hooves faded into the wet hush of the field. Isaiah exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders. He holstered the revolver, though his hand lingered there a beat too long. When he turned, Lila hadn't moved. Her eyes were still on the horizon, where Ewing had disappeared. He stepped closer, searching her face for fear, but there was none. Her jaw was tight, her breath steady. The only tremor came from her hands, barely visible, but there. He touched her sleeve gently, a question without words. She looked up, reading his expression, then shook her head once. No harm done. Not yet. Inside, the fire had burned low to embers. Isaiah added wood, the crackle cutting through the silence. Lila crouched near it, holding her palms close to the heat. He noticed how the reflection of the flame danced in her eyes, like she was watching something unseen. She reached for the small scrap of paper left on the table, the one that said, "I stay," and drew a line beneath it with the stub of charcoal. Then she added another word, "Still." Isaiah stood behind her, reading it over her shoulder. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words stayed lodged in his throat. Outside, the last of the rain fell soft against the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, then silence again. Lila laid the charcoal down, closed her hand over the word she'd written, and pressed her palm to the table, as if sealing it into the wood. The sound that followed was faint, a low, thin whistle of wind at the far window. But Isaiah caught it. He looked up sharply, jaw tightening. The shutters trembled once, then stilled. Whatever peace had found them, it wasn't ready to stay. The sky cleared slowly over black sage, leaving behind a thin light that felt fragile after the storm. Everything dripped. The fence, the grass, even the air. Isaiah worked the morning with quiet purpose, patching the cracked post that had given way in the rain. His hammer struck a rhythm against the wood, slow and even, the sound carrying out over the field. From the porch, Lila watched him. Her hair was still damp, braided now, the loose ends dark and glossy. She sat with the coat folded in her lap, mending its torn lining with a thin copper thread. Every so often she looked up, following the motion of Isaiah's hands, the rise and fall of his breath. There was a steadiness in him now, a calm that came not from peace, but from choosing it. By late morning, a sound broke the quiet. Hoofbeats, light and uneven, coming from the lower path. Isaiah straightened, wiping his palms on his trousers. A rider approached. A boy, maybe 17, hat too large for his head, posture too nervous for trouble. When he drew near, Isaiah recognized the face. Owen Pike, the storekeeper's nephew from Dry Willow. The boy halted at the gate, his horse blowing steam into the cool air. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice uncertain. "Didn't mean to intrude. Sheriff said the road might have washed out. Just came to check." Isaiah studied him, then nodded once. "Road's fine." Owen hesitated, eyes darting to the porch. Lila sat very still, watching him. When their eyes met, he looked down quick, twisting his hat. "I heard about what happened back in town. Folks talk." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "Do they?" The boy swallowed hard. "They said she didn't beg, that she wouldn't kneel. I thought that was brave." Lila tilted her head, trying to catch the meaning on his lips. Isaiah moved closer, his shadow falling across the boy's boots. "If you came to apologize," he said, "you can do it standing." Owen nodded fast. "Yes, sir. I just—" He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I brought this. One of the hymn pages from the church. My ma said you used to sing there before." He faltered. Figured maybe she could feel it. Isaiah took the page slowly. The paper was warped from moisture, ink blurred in places. A familiar song. "Come, ye weary." His fingers brushed the faded notes, and for the first time in years, something warm tugged beneath his ribs. He looked to Lila, then set the page on the table by the porch steps. With the flat of his palm, he began tapping the rhythm printed there. Soft, measured beats that followed the rise and fall of the melody. Lila leaned forward, placing her fingertips against the wood, feeling it travel up through her arms. Her eyes lifted, questioning. He nodded. "Song," he said, shaping the word carefully. She blinked, then smiled. A real one this time, small but deep. She tapped back, following his rhythm. Together, the beats became something that wasn't quite music, but wasn't silence either. Owen watched, wide-eyed. For a moment, the air between them held a kind of stillness that had nothing to do with quiet. A bridge built from rhythm and trust. When they stopped, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Reckon that's the prettiest sound I ever didn't hear," he said. Half a joke, half truth. Lila tilted her head again, reading his mouth. Then she stood, walked down the steps barefoot, and handed him a small scrap of cloth. The corner of a flour sack she'd torn, a stitched mark across it, 3 short lines. "Thank you." Owen blinked, then tucked it into his shirt pocket like something sacred. "If there's trouble again," he said, glancing toward the trail, "I'll bring word. Paper's safer than talk." Isaiah nodded, meeting the boy's gaze. "Appreciate it." Owen mounted up, his saddle squeaking, and looked back once. "You built a good place here," he said quietly, "even if the town don't see it yet." Then he clicked his tongue, and the horse trotted off down the road, water splashing under its hooves. Isaiah stood there a long while, watching until the figure disappeared behind the hill. The wind moved through the grass, gentle now, carrying the faint smell of sage and smoke. When he turned, Lila was still on the porch, fingertips tracing the edge of the hymn page. He joined her, sitting beside the table. The words blurred where her wet hand had touched them. "You want to keep it?" he asked. She looked at him, then pressed the paper flat, smoothing the wrinkles as if memorizing its feel. She didn't answer, but she didn't let it go either. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked side by side, repairing what the storm had taken. Lila gathered fallen twigs for kindling. Isaiah stacked new boards against the wall. When she passed him a tool, their fingers met and stayed there a breath longer than before. Near sunset, the light turned copper. A wind came from the north, cool and steady. Isaiah reached into his pocket and felt the small seed packets he'd brought from town. He rolled one between his fingers, a habit he'd forgotten he had. When he looked up, Lila was watching him. He held one out. "Tomorrow," he said, "planting." She nodded once, eyes bright in the fading light. The last rays of sun caught on the edge of the hymn page, turning the ink to gold. The wind lifted it, almost carrying it away, but Lila caught it and pinned it under her palm. Above them, a hawk wheeled in the high air, silent but certain. Isaiah watched it glide until it vanished beyond the ridge, leaving only the stillness of evening behind. Then, faint at first, a low hum carried through the distance, the echo of a whistle or a cry. He couldn't tell. It came from the direction of the town. Lila's hand tightened on the page. The sound faded, but it left the air uneasy. The next morning broke clean and sharp, the kind of light that made the world look freshly made. The hills glistened with dew, and the smell of damp sage hung thick in the air. Isaiah hitched the mule early, tossing a few sacks of grain into the wagon bed. Lila joined him without a word, her hands quick and practiced now. When he looked at her, she nodded toward the open road. Ready. They hadn't been back to Dry Willow since that day. The town sat 20 miles east, sun-baked and suspicious, but they needed nails, a tin scoop, seed for the new field. He almost told her to stay. Then he saw the way she tied her braid tighter, straightened her shoulders, and decided otherwise. Some ghosts had to be faced, together. By midday, the town appeared on the horizon like a stain. The road narrowed, lined with bare mesquite trees. Lila sat in the back, hands folded, eyes steady. When they entered the main street, conversations slowed. A man sweeping outside the saloon stopped mid-motion. Two women turned, whispering behind gloved hands. The old sign of the sheriff's office creaked on its rusty hinge. Isaiah pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. He could feel the stairs pressing against his back, but he didn't meet them. "Stay close," he said, and she nodded, stepping down from the wagon with quiet grace. Inside, the air was thick with dust and tobacco. Shelves of nails, coffee tins, and lantern oil lined the walls. The storekeeper, a heavy man with gray hair and a temper to match, froze when they entered. His eyes flicked from Isaiah to Lila, lingering on her face too long. "Well," he muttered, "didn't reckon I'd see that one again." Isaiah's jaw hardened, but he kept his voice calm. "Need seed, nails, 2 barrels of oil." The man leaned on the counter, smirking. "And what's the lady here after? Ain't seen her name on any ledger." Lila looked up at him, her face unreadable. She didn't need to hear the tone to know its weight. Isaiah turned, took the piece of chalk left near the counter, and wrote on the board propped behind him, "She's not for sale." The storekeeper's smirk widened. "Didn't say she was." Lila stepped forward. She took the chalk from Isaiah's hand, wiped the first word clean with her palm, and wrote again. Each letter slow and certain. "I am not for sale." The room went still. The only sound, the groan of the ceiling fan turning lazy circles above their heads. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, from near the doorway, a small laugh, a man's, sharp and mean, broke the silence. Isaiah turned. Macklin, the sheriff, leaned against the doorframe, hat tilted low. "Well, well," he said, "thought you'd ride off and stay gone." His eyes drifted toward Lila, a glint of mockery buried in them. "Didn't figure you'd bring her back into decent company." "Decent," Isaiah said flatly, "ain't what I'd call this town." Macklin's hand rested lazily on the butt of his revolver. Not as a threat, but a reminder. "Careful, Cole," he said. "Paperwork's a funny thing. I can make a line vanish, make another appear. Sometimes it's all in the writing." Lila was watching his mouth, catching enough to understand. Her hand brushed Isaiah's sleeve. He looked down, saw her write quickly on the counter with her fingertip. "Go." But he didn't move. He leaned forward instead, voice low. "You got papers?" he said. "Bring 'em. But next time, bring a reason." The sheriff's smile thinned. "You'll see 'em soon enough." Then he tipped his hat, turned, and walked back into the sun, boots grinding against the dust. Isaiah gathered the supplies in silence. The storekeeper said nothing else, just filled the order with a stiff jaw. Coins clinked on the counter. When it was done, Isaiah nodded once to Lila. She followed him out, chin high. The air outside was bright and raw. They loaded the wagon, neither speaking. As Isaiah tied the last bundle, he caught a reflection in the glass window across the street. Macklin, standing on the opposite side, notebook open, writing something down. Isaiah's chest tightened. He climbed onto the wagon, snapped the reins, and they rolled out of town. Dust rose behind them, swallowing the small, mean shapes of dry willow. Lila turned once, her eyes narrowing at the shrinking buildings. Then she faced forward again. The road home shimmered in the heat, endless and open. Halfway back, they stopped by a stream to water the mule. Lila took the piece of chalk from her pocket, the same one from the store, and wrote on the side of the wagon, "Thank you." Then beneath it, smaller, "Home soon." Isaiah ran his thumb over the word home until the chalk smeared. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Home." The sun dropped low behind them, casting the land in gold. The sound of water against stone, the creak of the wheels, the faint jingle of harness metal. It all felt like breath returning after too long held. But as the light dimmed, Isaiah's thoughts turned back to the sheriff's look, the way his hand had brushed that notebook. There'd been something deliberate in it, something cold. He turned to Lila. She was watching the stream, her reflection trembling in the water. The wind moved a few strands of hair across her face, and she didn't brush them away. "Whatever comes," he said softly, "we stay standing, you and me." She looked at him, then lifted her hand and tapped 3 times against the wagon's side. Together. The sound echoed faint and sure. Behind them, far across the plain, a single black horse cut through the evening light, its rider small, distant, and following. By late spring, the land around Black Sage began to soften. The wind no longer carried the bite of winter, but smelled of turned soil and rain left behind. Isaiah rose with the light and worked the field, his shovel biting into the damp earth, while Lila followed behind, scattering seeds from the small canvas pouch she'd stitched herself. They didn't speak much anymore, because they didn't need to. Their rhythm had become a language. 3 taps for water, 2 for rest, 1 for enough. Sometimes she would look up, and he'd already be there with the bucket. Or she'd brush her hand against his sleeve, and he'd slow without being asked. At midday, they sat beneath the half-burnt cottonwood behind the house, its bark blackened by an old fire. From a distance, the tree looked dead. Yet each spring, small green leaves pushed from its scars. Lila pressed her palm to the bark, feeling the slow pulse beneath. Then she opened a tin and tied a handful of old spoons with twine. She lifted the little cluster. The metal clicked softly, tender as breath. She pointed to the lowest branch. "Wind." Isaiah nodded, tied it high. When the breeze came, the spoons trembled, not melodic, but kind. A low, trembling sound that drifted through the yard like a heartbeat caught in air. Evening turned the light to honey. Lila sat near the porch, sketching shallow lines into a piece of pine. Isaiah mended the gate, humming low, an old tune he'd once leaned on in the dark. She tapped the porch rail 3 times, their signal for listen. Then she tapped again, slower, matching the spoons in the wind. He smiled, crossed the yard, and joined her. His hand met the wood, soft, steady, mirroring her tempo. Between their palms and the spoons, the air filled with small, imperfect notes. Not quite a song, but enough to make the evening hum. When they stopped, she leaned back against the post, eyes closed, face painted gold by the setting sun. He rose, brushing dust from his hands. "Tomorrow we'll start the east fence," he said. "Ground's ready." She caught his wrist and traced a word, one slow letter at a time. "Thank you." He swallowed the warmth that rose up. "Don't thank me," he said. "This place, it's ours now." Her gaze softened at ours, and she let his hand go. Night deepened. The wind moved through the cottonwood, setting the spoons to singing again, soft, irregular, endlessly patient. Isaiah closed his eyes and listened. For the first time, the sound didn't remind him of loss. It sounded like staying. Lantern light flickered inside. Lila poured leftover seeds into a jar and labeled it "Tomorrow's Garden." Before going in, she looked west. Isaiah followed her gaze. A faint glint flashed under the moon on the far ridge, metal catching light, then gone. The spoons clinked, but not quite in the rhythm of the wind. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. They watched the ridge until the glint disappeared. Only when the sound was gone did he exhale. "Inside," he said. She nodded. They closed the door. Outside, the spoons whispered on in the dark, thin voices rising and falling like the breath of the plains. Another soft morning over black sage. Isaiah worked the soil with the slow rhythm of a man who knew silence well. Beside him, Lila scattered seeds with quiet precision. Neither spoke. Breath and footsteps said enough. By noon, they rested under the old cottonwood. She tied more spoons to string. He helped her hang them. The breeze turned them to whispers. She smiled, pointed. Music. Toward dusk, they tapped the porch rail. Her light rhythm, his lower answer. When they finished, she traced on his wrist again. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said softly. "This place, it's ours now." She smiled, and the word "ours" seemed to belong to the land as much as to her. The sky cooled to bruised blue. Inside, the lantern fell low. She set the seed jar by the door. "Tomorrow's garden." Before they entered, she paused again, pointing west. A single flash on the ridge, and silence. "Inside," he said once more. They stepped in and shut the door. Outside, the spoons kept their quiet watch, soft, restless, and waiting. The dawn came slow, spilling gold over the fields until the earth itself seemed to breathe. Dew clung to the new vines, and the air was cool enough to taste. Isaiah stepped out first, his boots sinking softly into the damp ground. The smell of tilled soil and smoke from last night's fire hung in the air. Behind him, the cabin door opened with a small creak. Lila appeared, hair loose, the early sun painting her skin in pale warmth. She walked barefoot to the garden, her steps soundless. The beans had grown taller overnight, reaching for the light, their leaves trembling as the wind passed through. The spoons above them sang again, brighter now, scattering silver notes across the yard. Isaiah watched her crouch beside the plants. She brushed her fingertips over a leaf, then pressed her hand flat against the soil, feeling the life beneath. When she looked back at him, her eyes held something wordless but clear. "We made this." He joined her, kneeling in the dirt. Neither spoke. The wind moved through them like a voice too gentle to name. Later, inside, Lila found a spare board near the stove. She took a piece of charcoal and wrote one careful word across it: home. Then she paused, thinking, and added another beneath: shared. When Isaiah returned, wiping his hands on a rag, she showed it to him. He stared a long moment, then took the charcoal and wrote beside hers, slow and bold, "Coal Harrow." She smiled, tracing the line between the two names, her fingers leaving smudges of black dust. "Harrow sage," he said softly, testing the sound. "That's what we'll call it." Outside, Soot barked once, chasing a bird that skimmed too low. Lila laughed, quiet, breathy, but full. The laugh filled the cabin more than any song ever could. They carried the wooden sign outside together and set it into the ground by the fence. The wind lifted as if in approval, brushing their faces, ringing the spoons overhead. The sound was softer now, more certain, like the rhythm of a heart learning how to rest. When the salsasa work was done, Isaiah went inside and set 2 tin cups on the table. He poured coffee into both and gave one to her. She touched her lips to the rim, eyes meeting his. Neither said a word. He lifted his cup and tapped it lightly against hers. 3 slow beats, their shared rhythm. She smiled, understanding, then reached across the table and tapped back. Outside, the spoons whispered in time with them, a quiet song for the morning. As the sun rose higher, Isaiah looked at her, the way she sat in the light, the way her silence had turned into something stronger than sound. He knew this was what peace looked like. Not the kind you find, the kind you build. One heartbeat, one breath, one quiet act of staying. He reached out, brushed a lock of hair from her face and said, "We'll stay, Lila, long as this land will have us." She nodded, eyes soft, and traced one word against his palm: always. They sat together in the stillness. The world outside unfolded, slow and alive. The spoons chimed once, then faded into the hush of morning, leaving only the steady rhythm of 2 people who had finally come home. In the quiet lands of Harrow Sage, 2 people found something most folks spend a lifetime searching for: peace that stays. Their story reminds us that love doesn't always come with grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes it arrives softly, through shared silence, through a steady hand, through the courage to stay when walking away might seem easier. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share what it meant to you in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your memories, or maybe a time when life gave you a second chance too. If you enjoyed this tale of the Old West, where the winds carried both loneliness and hope, please give it a like to help more people find it. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story under the same wide sky. Thank you for spending your time here with us, for listening, remembering, and keeping the spirit of Western love alive. May the road ahead be kind to you, and may you always find a bit of peace, just like Isaiah and Lila did in your own Harrow Sage.